Welcome to our very first dialogue event. This is a very special occasion. It was only 5 weeks ago when this was just an idea. And here we are, and we've tackled a really big subject today. And rather than just talk about race in a singular way, we're talking about everybody of different colors in the country. And it's we got a great panel, and I'm really happy everyone showed up here. It's a really big deal to have everybody here. And the moderator, I want to introduce Sharon Nari Williams, who's going to be moderating. And I'm going to turn it over to her at this point. And Sharon?
Thank you, John. Hello, everyone. Welcome to an American Mosaic dialogue, the first iteration around race, what color is America. We appreciate you being here with us today. Just a little housekeeping real quick. Our panelists are amazing, and we'll hear from them in just a second. We just want you to know that today is a safe space and creating an opportunity for us to have conversation cross-culturally in different regions throughout the country and throughout the world. And that's what today is about. John is a wonderful storyteller and really interested in really just hearing everyone's opinion and how they are moving through space and time right now. And so we welcome you to the conversation via the Q&A box. So if you have any questions during while we're speaking, or even at the end when we say it's Q&A time, please feel free to put your questions in there, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can today. I just want to backtrack 1 second. And John, can you tell us a little bit about how you started interviewing people across the country for this project?
Yeah, Sharon, thank you. 3 years ago, I think I realized that I didn't recognize my country, and I needed to find out who we are today. And I, like many people, it was probably I was functioning in my silo, in my echo chamber. And so I set out on a journey around the country, talking to people, strangers that I would meet. And I would just show up someplace with my video camera and start talking to people. And if they agreed, to sign a release. And anyway, so, approximately about 100 conversations later and about 26 states, I've talked to pretty much a cross section of everybody in our country. And the reason I wanted to do this is to create a dialogue. I wanted to find out who we are. And I realized that we don't know who we are. And that's been enabled by technology, certainly in the last 10 years. And when you really start talking and crossing divides, and we all have different ideas about things, but there's many things we do agree on. And so that was really the objective, is crossing divides and trying to create a dialogue so we understand each other, because we're not as far apart as we think we are. And we have a lot of people that are trying to divide us. And so that's the project. And then this is a logical extension. And it turns out that it's something that's, I'm a storyteller, but I'm not telling the story. I'm actually taking other people's stories and I'm putting them out. And that's what I'm doing. So I'm just kind of just amplifying what other people are thinking and saying. And that's something that Sharon and I have connected on, because Sharon's a storyteller. And she tells in a little different way, but that's what we do. So that's really what American Mosaic is about.
Awesome. Thank you, John. And thank you
Thank you, everybody.
for creating the platform for us to just get to know each other and have conversation, because we both believe that the world will be a better place if we understood and had these conversations more often with people we didn't know. So we appreciate that. So this is a unique panel. And because this is a panel that the only requirement that you needed to have to be a part of it is being human. And that's it. Any other credentials didn't matter. Didn't matter of how many degrees you have or what special circumstances you have to be on a panel with special knowledge. This is just about being human and just sharing. Every panelist will just be sharing from their experiences, and so this is wow. So therefore, it should be easy for everyone out there who's watching to join into the conversation. So I feel like I've talked way too much right now. And so what we're going to do is allow our panelists to introduce themselves, their first name, where they're calling from or where they want it from, whatever they would like to use. And then we asked the question to all the panelists of what are 3 things that you would like for people to know about you? And so let's kick it off. And today we're going to start with Carmen. Welcome, Carmen.
Hello, everybody. Yep, I'm Carmen. So right now I'm currently in Texas. I pretty much born and raised in Mexico. And also I happen to be a designer. So that's me.
Thank you, Carmen. Jasmine.
Hello, I'm Jasmine. I am originally a New Yorker, but currently living in Puerto Rico. Important things to know about me. I am the product of a extremely hardworking single mother. I am Caribbean by heritage, as well as from the South. My grandparents are from Virginia and North Carolina. I suppose another important thing is I'm very passionate about creating equitable post-disaster recovery systems. It's very important to me to help other people have their voices be heard and to create inclusive spaces. So those are the things that I am most passionate about.
Thank you, Jasmine. And I'm from Fayetteville, North Carolina, born and raised. Renee, welcome.
Yes, thanks. My name is Renee Nari. I'm also a designer. And I confuse a lot of people. I'm from Mexico. My parents are Mexican. So I was born and raised in Tijuana, Mexico. And I have a French first name, so completely throws people off. And then I have an Italian last name, but I'm Mexican, like 100%. So.
Awesome. Thank you, thank you, Renee. Trevor, with showing us how beautiful Washington State can be. Welcome.
Hi, my name's Trevor. Let's see. I'm a Japanese American, 3.5 generations removed. So that means like my great grandparents came over from Japan. I've recently graduated college last month with a degree in computer science, and I have only ever been stung by a mosquito once.
Wow. You haven't been to North Carolina, have you?
I have not.
Puerto Rico.
Thank you, Trevor. Now we have Izell.
Hi, I'm Izell. I am from Tacoma, and I attended an experimental middle and high school. I love studying history and political science, and I also like Tuscany candles.
Awesome. Can you send me one of those? Thank you. Hi, Daryl. How are you doing today? Welcome. Can you let us know?
Hi, guys.
Hi.
Yeah, so Daryl Collins. I'm going to bring some humor into this stuff. So anyway, I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan. I've lived out in Seattle for close to 30 years now. I graduated from a college back in Detroit called College for Creative Studies. So I've been working out here as a creative for that entire time. I love the Northwest. I've got a lot of friends, a lot of contacts out here. I just really love the area. One thing people don't know about me, in my spare time, I build Lego sets.
Nice. My nephew would love you. Lego.
Yeah.
I just hit my 20th anniversary in Seattle, so here we
Oh, there
go.
you go.
There it is.
Yeah.
Hey,
Catching up.
hey, I know, right? Hey, Shayna, how's it going? Welcome.
Hello, hi.
Hi.
Sorry, I'm struggling here. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. There you go.
So I'm a bartender from Butte, Montana. I'm born and raised here, but everybody asks me where I'm from all the time.
That's awesome. I needed you at my house yesterday, Shayna. I really did. Alexandria, welcome.
She's not going.
Okay. Alexandria.
No, they're not in.
They're not in right now, but we'll get to know
No.
Alexandria in a few minutes.
No.
And
Yeah, Shayna
yeah.
should mention. I'd like Shayna to say something about her heritage. She didn't mention that.
Okay.
If Shayna, if you're there.
Yeah. So I actually come from a few different backgrounds. I'm Mexican American, Native American, Sicilian, and German, and a little bit of Irish. So I'm pretty much everything.
Awesome. Thank you. Oh, okay. Thank you, Gina, for letting me know that. Alexandria is not part of the panel. I thought she was. But thank you, Alexandria, for being in the audience and being with us today. I really do appreciate that. She's helping back behind the scenes. So we have a great staff behind the scenes that's helping keep everything going today. So for the audience, please, there's at the bottom of your screen, if you take your cursor down, there's a button that says Q&A. If you click that button, then throughout the show, you can ask any questions in that box or make any comments. So we really do appreciate that. So are y'all ready to have the conversation? Ooh. So my first question is how has racism impacted you in your life? And I know that's a really big question, but let's kick it off. And this time we'll go a little backwards, and let's start with Isel.
All right. Well, for me, I think racism has impacted me more so in my education. For the community I live in, it seems as though we've been sort of grouped together in low-income communities with inadequate resources and with schools that weren't properly funded. And for me, that's been a major roadblock and something I've been very intentional about going around and trying to uplift people with me.
Thank you. Education is one of the things that it seems like everyone is trying to figure out how to get right. And I don't know at what point did it become so wrong, because for me as a child, I felt as though education was the thing for everyone to focus on. And then all of a sudden it became no funding. It has never caught up with equal opportunity for everyone. So I really do appreciate you kicking it off with education. Daryl, how has racism impacted you? You're on mute, Daryl. Hold on one second, Gerald. We can't hear you because you're on mute. There
Oh
you
yeah,
go.
here I am. Yeah, there I go. Yeah, racism hasn't really impacted me the way some young Black folks have been impacted by it, because I grew up in the 60s, 70s. So it was different because everything was a little bit more separated. You were a little bit more separated from other races. It wasn't until we moved into a working class sort of lower range, middle income neighborhood in Detroit. And then when we moved into that white neighborhood, that's when I really saw racism, because that's when I would be called nigger daily. And then my mom, for some reason, wanted me to be, to know how to make a living and all that stuff. So she made me get a paper route. So I got a paper route throwing both papers, the Detroit Free Press and the Detroit News. So I would often, just approaching someone's house, this little Black boy, um, dogs would attack me. People wouldn't know who I am sometimes. So I would always be confronted with like, oh, who's this nigger coming up to my door? So I knew right away what that look was. So then when I got older, that look of disgust changed when I moved into the business world. Then I would see that look and I would identify that look. And it had nothing to do with paranoia. It's like, it's the look, when you walk into a room and someone looks at you sideways. Um, so I would always be leery of that. So one thing I learned is that it's important to wear one hat. Um, so racism has taught me one thing. It's taught me a thing that I don't code switch ever. I always come at people the same way because I want them to come at me the same way. So racism has impacted me quite a bit, but it's also made me a little bit stronger, like within myself, and I can stand up for myself more than I could. Because I do think about all the time when racism does confront me, I think about that Black boy in Detroit who had that paper route with those German shepherds chasing him, having to get on top of someone's car, and I'm just doing my job. I'm delivering the news. Um, so yeah, so that's what I go back to, and me being a visual person, those visuals kind of help me. So yeah, that's all I got.
Thank you for sharing that. We appreciate that. Carmen, how has racism impacted you?
So one other thing that you guys don't know, I've actually lived in 4 different countries, including Mexico and the United States. I lived also in Italy and in Spain. Oh, actually in Switzerland. So 5 countries. Whoops, bad at math sometimes. And really, I never experienced racism, and I wasn't very aware of my race until I lived in the United States. And it was more as a grown-up when I was on my own and I lived in the East Coast in Providence, Rhode Island. For the first time one day, I got into a very simple quarrel. For me, it was a funny little thing, and they called me a beaner. And I said, damn right, you better know where I'm from. And somebody said, they just insulted you. And I said, oh, I have never heard that term. I don't know. And that was a very interesting kind of thing. That was the first time I experienced racism. That was like through the last days of university. Never experienced it in Europe because that's a whole different kind of an environment. And then recently, I guess in the jobs that I've been getting, most recently was not too long ago. And I have never been more aware of my race, my sexism, my age, at all in my life until now. And I just find that very bizarre. And it's super it's almost like a slap on my face because it's like, why does it matter who I am or what I am? As soon as I find out I'm Latina, and kind of does a switch. And then they're all baffled by it. And they call me, they're like, oh, well, you must be Mexican and Latina. And so you're very fiery. And, they call names and stuff. And I'm like, oh, just because I'm determined? I mean, treating everybody equally. I approach everybody that's friendly because that's the way I was raised by my parents. I mean, their backgrounds is Italian and from Spain, and you know, like also like the actual mestizos in Mexico, the Aztecs and stuff. So I have that background, but we were always like, who cares what you look like? Who cares what if you're a guy or a girl? Like, you know, treat everybody equally and have respect for everybody as much respect you want for yourself. So this is something very shocking. And it actually, not too long ago, I had my very first panic attack. It lasted 3 days. I never had that before in my life. And that was very interesting. And so now I'm really acknowledging what is better for me to do, right? And I like to be involved with all kinds of people, good people, not this toxic stuff, because you know what? That's how they function in life. I try to change it, but I can't really do much other than just respect, say thank you. Hopefully something impacting will happen to them soon, but you never want to wish anything awful on anybody. But yeah, it's super interesting. I've received a whole lot more racism being in the United States than living in Mexico or anywhere in Europe. And to me, that's just kind of like, whoa, it's a revelation, because I was like, whatever, I'm just being human, you know? So
Yeah,
that's my experience.
I definitely understand that. I remember I was working at Seattle University for a while, and my boss came in from Sweden, and then we had a meeting with someone who had just started with the university that was from Chicago, and she had no clue his facial expressions meant. I was like, he was looking at us like we was crazy, and she was like, "What? I wonder what that was about," but I had never experienced it before. So culturally, it's definitely a thing of getting to know how to read each other's culture is definitely impactful. Let's go to Trevor. How has racism impacted your life?
Oh, there's a plane coming. Okay. I guess, okay, so the first time I really like thought about racism was probably around 7 or 8. I was at 7 or 8. My grandma on my mom's side is from Utah. So we were road tripping down to Utah, and we made a pit stop in Idaho. And I got out and I went to the bathroom, and I was like with my family. And there's this like probably like maybe 40s white man, and he just gave us the dirtiest look I think I've ever seen from someone. He didn't say anything, and he kind of kept his distance, but he would just the large sneer just right at us. I didn't really know what that meant because I was so young, and I was like, "Hey, Dad, like, why does that dude look like he hates us?" And he's like, "Don't worry about it." And it took me like a while until like multiple years later. I was probably a teenager at that point, and we went to the same pit stop. And I made the realization. I was like, "Oh man, that dude was probably like a white supremacist or something. That he just hated our family because we just rolled up." And it was really strange. And I was like, "Oh." And it kind of like for that one pit stop, I now call the white supremacist pit stop because it's like we always go to the same one, and I just always affiliate that notion with that one pit stop. But for me, right, because like another thing also, I guess, was I went to college for 2 years in Utah at the University of Utah. Go Utes. But one of the things that happened was I was talking to some dudes there that were born and raised in Utah. I wouldn't say they were racist or anything. It was just kind of an ignorance. And a large thing that happens if you study like Asian American history is the notion of the model minority myth, especially for Japanese Americans, because like my grandparents got interned. And then afterwards, a lot of people will be like, it's so amazing that your grandparents were able to like come out and like be successful and accepted in America. Like, wow, why can't other minorities do that? And it's just inherently incorrect. You know, the model minority myth was propagated by white people to other us from some of the other minorities, like and like raise the bar in order to tell the other ones. Like they're just using it like as a tool instead of identifying us as people. Then I would always tell them, I was like, well, it's like a double-edged sword because my grandparents didn't teach my parents Japanese, and we all have names that sound like my name. My first name is Trevor. It is not something Japanese. So in itself, you know, you kind of lose a bit of your culture when they're trying to do it, because back then for the Issei and the Nisei, the first generation and the second generation that came from Japan, it was all about assimilation. Like, I don't want to be different. I'll do everything the same as American. I'll dress American. I'll drive the American car, because they didn't want to be hated. They didn't want to be othered. And in that is interesting, because a lot of people that are my generation, like the Sanse or the Yonsei, want to like take back some of that that culture that they lost. Like they want to learn Japanese. They want to go learn more about Japanese culture, because at this point it's something that's different for me. And when I go to Japan, you know, I look the same as them, but I don't act the same and I don't speak the same. So it's kind of like you're an alien in your own culture. So it's something else.
Wow, that's powerful. Thank you. Shayna, how has racism impacted you?
So I hate saying this, but I feel like I live in a part of the country where I don't see it. So I think that a lot of people almost from where I'm from, they don't believe it's happening on the level that it's happening. When I was a kid, I was always like a little bit more tan than some of the other kids, and I would also be called beaner and stuff, and I didn't understand what that meant. My grandfather is unfortunately extremely racist. I feel like my family like lets him get away with it because he fought in Vietnam, but I personally don't see a day-to-day things happening around me where it's obvious. So unless you're like somebody who's like up to current events, you know, keeps in the news, keeps up to date with what's happening, if you're from Butte and you live in Butte, you almost don't see it.
Wow, thank you. That's interesting. Jasmine.
Yeah, that's a hard question. And I think actually, Shayna, you touched on what I was going to answer, which is, I mean, I think as a person of color being raised in the United States, I don't think that it's possible to not be impacted by racism. But I do think that there's a question of how aware are you of the impact of racism in your life, depending on the visibility, because racism is built into the very fabric of American society. So for me personally, there's been both negative and positive. I'll start with the positive, since I always start with negative maybe. The positive, there was the mentioning of education. I would say racism has actually showed up in positive ways in terms of my education, in that I've been fortunate to benefit from programs that are meant to enrich and uplift minority children in underserved communities. And so I've been very fortunate to go to some of the best schools in the world, and I worked really hard to get there. And then on the flip side, there are, you know, sort of comments about what is affirmative action, and is that just sort of a handout? And so, you know, I think for me, racism shows up in the double standards that I've experienced, you know, a feeling that as a woman of color, I have to work twice as hard, and still will be treated as if I was, you know, given a handout to get to where I am, instead of having worked twice as hard. And I guess I am fortunate in some ways. I've only experienced sort of, I guess, direct racism a handful of times. I've been called the N-word before, and even though it's only happened once or twice, you know, it hurt. It hurt. It's a painful word. It's shocking. I can even just thinking back on those experiences can feel in my body, you know, the blood creeping into my face, the feeling of shame, the feeling of being physically attacked almost. And so, and I think that the lasting effect of that is the times where you have to wonder if you're being treated a certain way because of your skin color versus being treated a certain way just because the other person's a jerk, you know, or having a bad day. Is somebody looking at me this way because of something that's going on with them, or are they looking at me this way because of my skin color? You know, am I getting bad customer service right now because this place just has shitty customer service, or is it because, you know, I am a Black person? So so that shows up a lot. And then I guess the last piece I'll say is, as a person of mixed heritage, I'm Black, Puerto Rican, I've got Native American, I've got a lot in my background. You know, I think that the subtle ways in which racism and bigotry can show up is if people don't realize that you are a member of the group that they're disparaging in that moment. And so, you know, as a Black person, maybe having to listen to comments about Latinos, and as a you know, and so, yeah, I think it definitely shows up more subtly in my life, but it's always there. It's always pervasive. And I think that's maybe the truly damaging aspect.
Don't you just love it when the hosts mute themselves because their dog is whining and you just like, okay, sorry, sidebar. Renee, how has racism impacted you?
I would say that I've been thinking a lot about this, and for me, it's been a combination of things, like maybe starting out with really subtle things. Growing up in Mexico, I never saw that. Like, I just kind of experienced life, and I had friends who we used to actually call each other the United Nations, because there was a blonde friend of mine, there was a Japanese friend of mine, a Korean friend of mine, and Afro. I think his heritage from Cuba, but he was Mexican. So like it was like this, almost like this joke in a way, like where we just sort of called each other that because that's what we noticed. And so thinking about that, and thinking about, you know, how that shaped my view of things, because like it came from love. I mean, we loved each other. We were a group of friends. We all went to basically grew up from elementary school all the way up to middle school and high school. And then that's when my family moved to the United States. And so I come from this sort of like, we're all the same. Like, you know, we may look different, but you know, it's all the same, right? We're all the same. And then coming to America, thinking about, you know, this is the melting pot. So to me, it was kind of like, oh, this is going to be more of the same, you know, yeah, it's, you know, the same. And then as my experiences here have taught me, like, maybe because I dominate the language a little bit better, like I didn't experience it as, you know, as like, you know, frontal as other people, but I do think that there are things that kind of went past my, you know, I didn't understand either, and was kind of naive about that. But you know, along the way, like as I grow up, as I was in my career, I've had clients kind of like, you know, obviously I would do anything for my clients to, you know, as a designer, like you show up for your clients, you try to help them in their business. And some people would make comments like, you know, you're Mexican, like it's can, right? Like you can. And I'm like, okay, like, sure, yeah. Like what, you know, so it's kind of this subtle joke, like subtle trying to inflict like humor in it. And then you realize that, you know, that it's like, oh, okay. You know, so that it's all these little subtle, you know, little death by a thousand cuts kind of thing, where like, it's all these little subtle things that like you hear. And as you know, as you become more aware of them and the people around you, I mean, that's where I feel like, you know, for me, it's been I haven't felt as impacted, but I do think I do see it around me, and I do acknowledge it more. I have two kids now who are biracial. They're my wife is white, and so I think about that. I think about that a lot, about how, you know, I'm trying to kind of talk about my experiences in a way that hopefully, like, they're not gonna probably adopt my culture in a way that the same way I do, and I acknowledge that because you know, where we live in Seattle. You know, they speak English. I'm teaching them Spanish, so there are some things I try to do traditions, and I'm hoping. So for me, it's more like as far as I've been able to kind of dodge some things or kind of not have it affect me as much, I do see it around me, and I do think that my responsibility lies with my kids, and not just to make them aware, but also like, you know, teach them love, you know, teach them to love their neighbor and love their friends, and how I remember growing up.
Thank you. Thank you, Renee. John, how has racism impacted you?
Yeah. Yes. Interesting. I was just thinking when Renee was talking, because well, first of all, I've traveled considerably, and I've spent some time in East Africa and some places where I was kind of like a minority, because I really wasn't going necessarily where the tourists were going either. So I had an opportunity to be exposed to cultures and ideas, and what I found is when you spend the time meeting and talking to the people, you know, I came in a little place, and I was invited to like a Muslim wedding, and so, you know, I went in the mosque, and I'm there because all the men go one place and the women go another place, and it's the way they do things. But just spending time with those people, and I learned a lot, and I learned a lot about accepting, listening. I was in Mexico and spent a great deal of time there, almost 10 years, working on a project before I started this American Mosaic project. And I was in a little village, and so I'm like the minority, and I'm the white guy that comes in, and so it was kind of a test. And the first year, it was getting acquainted, and they would say, well, okay, so, you know, he's the white guy, and then he looks like a, you know, and they understand I'm coming and I'm bringing some money, and that's good. It's good for their economy. And but it took a while to get past this pretty soon, and I realized I had to earn their respect. I didn't assume anything. And pretty soon, they would start to treat me kind of like, this guy's okay. He's kind of okay. He's kind of okay. And it was one thing that was interesting. There was a guy that was working on this project, and there was a crew, and they were doing something for me. And so he was the head of the project. And well, he didn't really want to talk to me because, you know, his English was non-existent, and my Spanish is almost non-existent, but it works. So there was one of the fellows that spoke English, so he'd always have him come over. So we're working and working and working on the project. Then pretty soon he realized that I knew what I was talking about, so I kind of proved myself to him. Then he would start to communicate with me. It's just little subtle things like that. But it's sort of like breaking these barriers. But it's interesting to be on the other side, because I know they would joke about me, and they would tell jokes about me, about this gringo, this kind of silly gringo. And they also had a nickname for me. And they called me Chachalaca. And Chachalaca is kind of an offensive thing, because Chachalaca is a bird that talks a lot. And so it was kind of interesting to sort of be on the other side. But so, and, you know, I've had a lot of different experiences with different people and different races. But I guess I just thought of one thing that's really important. I think I shared this with Sharon. Many years ago, okay, in the military. And it was a good buddy of mine who was Black. And we went someplace. And this was my very first experience. We go in this place. A server comes over, doesn't even acknowledge you, doesn't say anything, just kind of looks at me and says, I can't serve him. And I go like, what? And, you know, it was a long story. I'll keep it short just to that. But that was my very first experience of really understanding. And I never forgot that. And it was the very first time. And I couldn't feel what he felt, but I felt very much for him. And he just said, come on, John, let's go. Let's get out of here. Let's get out of here. So, I mean, I was just a young kid, Seattle, in the blue bubble, never experienced anything like that. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we have a question panelist from the community, and David asks, do any of you feel at any time completely comfortable in society, or is the racism always prevalent on a day-to-day existence? And Jasmine, I know you've already answered it in the box, but would you like to expand on, if you would like to tell us a little bit about how you responded to that?
Sure. I was just saying that I often feel comfortable. I think I also am just someone who's very comfortable in her skin, generally speaking, and that's taken work over the years. But I would say that for me, racism isn't necessarily always prevalent, but race is almost always present for me. I am aware of race and race dynamics. You know, I have a very diverse set of friends, but I am aware when I am one of the only or one of two or three people of color in the room. Or from watching a movie, or if I'm looking, you know, flipping through a magazine, I am aware of a lack of diversity, you know, visible lack of diversity. So I think for me, race is always present. And I think in a lot of subtle ways and on a daily basis, I am reminded of that otherness, at least in this country. Now it can completely, and you know, this is a conversation about race in America, but that for me was completely flipped on its head when I visited Ethiopia. And that was actually one of the most kind of like mind-blowing experiences for me in my life, was the moment when I stepped off the plane and I looked around the airport and everyone looked like me, like same complexion, same hair texture, you know, everyone from the sort of like luggage porters through to the, you know, business people on their way to their first class lounge, like I was everywhere. And I remember in that moment having a very real thought of like, so this is what it feels like to be in the majority. I never knew that feeling in any space I had ever been in, certainly not in the United States. So, you know, I think also having had that experience to contrast, yeah, race is always there for me, at least in this country.
Thank you. You made me think about how being in Seattle, right? You can be in Seattle and you can, it depends on you finding the community that you want to be around and things of that nature. And you learn that more and more as you get older and you start to move around in places, that some places you have to go and find people that look like you, and some places you just naturally get off the plane and they're there. So when I first started living in Seattle, when I would travel back east and have a stop in like Atlanta or something like that, the first thing I would text my friends back is, I see Black people. Because they're in the airport. I was like, wait a minute, they're working, they're everywhere I look. And then you just get this sense of, okay, all right, let's do this. And so being very aware of the spaces that we're in is just something that happens naturally when you're used to being one of the few.
And I'll add to that, you know, the burden sometimes of having to create that community depending on where you are. I spent the last 8 years living in Austin, Texas, and while I would say Austin is incredibly culturally diverse, it is not racially diverse. And that, I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. I'm not making that up. So, you know, in Austin, being somebody who was born and raised in New York City, in Manhattan, in probably one of the most diverse places in this country, Austin was a shock for me. And before that, in college, I lived in Raleigh, Durham, which is diverse but incredibly segregated. So you have some spaces that'll be all white, and you have some spaces that'll be all black. And then during my undergraduate years, I was actually part of a community trying to build more of an Asian community. I have no Asian heritage whatsoever, but that was important for me to create spaces for everyone. So, in Puerto Rico now, I'm very much part of a community here that's trying to create more of a presence, because we certainly have Black Lives Matter here, but that means something very different for Afro-Latino than it does for sort of Black American. And I'm hesitant to say that because Puerto Rico is part of the United States, but that's a whole other panel discussion. But we're here being very intentional about creating a community for sort of Black expats in Puerto Rico, and we have to do that, because otherwise the space doesn't exist, and it can be exhausting, quite frankly.
It is. Isel, you had something to add.
Yeah, I wanted to I wanted to add that while like the personal and direct interactions fluctuate, I can't help but notice the racism in my community still, and in the institutions. Like when I drive around like the east or south side of Tacoma, I see like an abundance of fast food restaurants, crumbling infrastructure everywhere. But when I go to the north end, it's a lot of free markets, a lot of like health areas, and a lot of new buildings, a lot of new roads. It's very present in the makeup of the community. It's hard not to notice.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a comment here, and I just want to get how everyone feels about this one. Many people who claim to identify with Black people, racism, have also enjoyed passing and certain benefits from or being more accepted by whites, while calling themselves POCs and minorities for certain advantages and opportunities. They've often gotten to play it both ways. As a Black man, some of most racism I have experienced here from POCs, minorities. If we talk, we must talk real. Does anyone have anything that they would like to address there, Trevor?
Yeah, I got it. So the Derek Chauvin's partner who killed George Floyd was a Hmong man, so he's Vietnamese. There's, I'm not gonna lie to you, there's like, and for the Asians, even in just like actual Asian culture, like Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Southeast Asians, there's a lot of racism and hate there. Like in World War II, Japan colonized Korea, and that's not that long ago. And for the Asian American community, there's also a good amount of for justice. Like frequently, well, for the older Japanese Americans, it's always like, well, if you have to marry non-Japanese, marry white. And there's this skin whitening controversies that they have in those countries and over here, and it's still very prevalent. Something we've tried to do is I've tried to we're doing like workshops for because I'm a Japanese Buddhist, so for our ministers who are from Japan that don't really understand the complexities of American racism and social relations, we're trying to run like workshops to talk to them about it. And it's very interesting because they come from a society that is like 98% Japanese, so it's very majority dominant. And for them to try to understand the history of hate over here and come and see that they're coming to I guess congregations, we would call it sanghas, or gathering groups of people that are Buddhists that are of differing races and colors, is interesting for them to adapt. But no, you're right. Like there is injustice. I believe that like everyone has a certain amount of injustice in them, and for some cultures, or for like us as Asian Americans, it's easier to hide it because a lot of people still do believe in the model minority myth that we are better than the other minorities, and that's just not true. But like they use it as a justification to other us from them, whoever them may be. And for the Black Lives Matter movement, you're right. There have been people that I've talked to that are like, I stand with the Black Lives Matter movement. Whereas before, in personal conversations, they're proud of their heritage of not being like darker, of being someone that was accepted more by white people. Because for us, like, I'm not that big of a person. I'm not physically intimidating. You know, police officers are usually nice to me because I kind of play up that, oh, I'm helpless, please help me. it's just like the way that society sees you, and you've got to use it to your advantage when you can. But it's something that we're trying to deal with, at least as the younger generation, but it's something that we're not going to solve in a day. So
Awesome. Daryl, would you like to chime in on that around racism within cultures, POCs, and minorities?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I've always worked with a lot of Asian folks here in Seattle, and those have been the only folks that have really had honest conversations with me, like about race. Because I remember one designer when I was working at Starbucks Coffee Company in the creative department. She approached me and she said, "Daryl, how does it feel to be like the only Black designer in Seattle?" You know? And I looked at her and I said, you know, she's trying to find out information. She wasn't saying some type of joke, right? So I knew she was like investigating something. And I knew like deep down in her own self, she had seen some of that within her own life, you know, like being the only Asian person in an office in a creative setting. So I just told her, because back in the sort of 90s, I was naive to race. My thing was, I was always like, I just got to get in there, do my job, be strong, be better than everybody else, kick everybody else's ass, you know, come up with the best designs, and that's how I'll get through. That was always my mentality when I came from Detroit. So I was living in this sort of like, it's all about me bubble. You know, race doesn't affect me because I'm such a badass creative, you know, but it wasn't. So I often think about that question that this other creative asked me in my life now, because I usually am the only Black guy in the room that's doing some type of creative thing. And so, yeah, so I've always appreciated the Asians in my life who have like approached me that way. And I was fortunate enough, I dated this gal from Taiwan, and she would often, when I was around her friends, they would tell me honestly how they felt about white people. And I thought, man, because I knew at the time, like what one of the speakers has said, you know, there's a tier like when it comes to race in this country, and we have to realize that there is a tier, right? If we're, you know, like Black folks are right below Asian folks. I mean, this is how America is made up, and Asians are always viewed better than Black people, you know, and Asians themselves, like these Taiwanese folks I was hanging out with, they knew that. Their thing was like, at least we're not Black, you know? And they weren't saying that bad to me. They were just saying, because you folks were slaves, you got your freedom, fought for your rights, and they still treat you like shit, right? So they knew there was this tier system. So to experience it that way was always interesting for me. But now in my life, now that, you know, we are in the 21st century, I don't see myself as being separate than anyone else, you know, because now I know I can be shot anytime, anywhere. It doesn't matter, you know. So now I do identify myself as, yeah, I am Daryl Collins, but I'm also a Black man and I'm living in a world that sees me as a threat for some strange reason, they still see me as a threat. So I have to be aware of that, like always. And I tell my friends this at this place I work at now. I tell them, I say, I think of myself as a radio, as a frequency. When I say something and someone's looking at me, because I'm a black man, they're thinking all kinds of stuff first before I even open up my mouth. So I always have to be like aware of that. So this is how it has affected me, and this is how it continues to affect me. But now I want to use this for like good. I want to use this power for good. I want people to identify like, yeah, we need your help. We need allies who are white to help us combat racism, if that makes sense.
Cool. Thank you, Daryl. I just want to get y'all opinion on this statement that we have in the Q&A box. History and experience often proved white people can't be trusted in the long run. And they often have the savior's mentality and want to run shit, which makes true, real relationship impossible with them. Let's go with Renee.
I mean, that's a pretty loaded statement, because, I think from my point of view, I feel like we all have to work together. We all need each other. So to say that something's impossible, like, like I don't think that way. Like, I think that we do have to have some positivity and trust, even if it's, there's got to be some level of trust that people are coming with good intentions. I think for me, I feel like, I feel like I come from a culture of kind of like, Trevor had mentioned, I do think Latinos, some Latinos are racist. I do see that now. I talk about this with some of my friends who are Mexican and who grew up in Mexico too, and we acknowledge that there were things like, there was prejudice things that, we treated darker Mexicans different, and as a culture. So like, I think it's it is painful to kind of acknowledge that you say, yeah, like even, we are people of color, but we also like have, our tears and how messed up that is. Right. So as far as like, coming back to the question a little bit more, I felt like when I moved to the States, I identified with the culture. Like I grew up in a border town, so it wasn't that hard, to be influenced by American culture, pop music at the time, like the 80s. So a lot of all that stuff that I sort of associated myself with America and seeing, I never saw it as a thing until I came here. But I like to think that, yeah, maybe history hasn't really been kind. And, but one thing I do, I'm cognizant of, and I sort of, I fight against, I feel like cancel culture. Because even like, to me, like the all this stuff about statues being kind of, dethroned and defaced, I actually feel that it kind of muddies the waters a little bit, because it kind of takes it away from the context of where we are now, and what we're fighting for a future. Not to say that, to me, like history, it's almost like I would like it to be a reminder that this is where we come from, and this is the history that we have. We have to own the history. We can't run away from it. We can't change it. Even if we tear down a statue, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. So like, what's the point of that? So to me, it's kind of like, how can we live with that, but also move forward? And we need each other. I mean, I feel like we have to be allies. We can't do it without everybody coming together.
Thank you, Renee. I have a question here that I would like to start with Carmen and Shayna in answering, and it is, Can any of you separate your race from your culture? If you are American, do you consider that you are all of one culture, even if your racial backgrounds are different?
Who goes first?
You do, because I heard you first.
Okay, sounds good. That's a very cool question, actually, very interesting, because living in 5 different countries, they're all different cultures, and pretty much almost a border baby like Renee, really like living in the north edge right there. It's like not fully Mexico, but it's Mexico, but you also have this American tradition. So you're like already a mixed like cooking pot, because the border towns are a whole different kind, I think, region, like a little country in itself, because you have almost both languages that clash. So as soon as like, you know, being raised in Mexico and then going to Texas for just a little bit to finish high school and then taking off to Europe and living in different countries and then coming back to the States in the East Coast and coming back to Texas, I've noticed I am just a human that exists. I so happen to be of a certain race, a certain gender, and honestly, what I was able to do is I learned of a bunch of little cultures. So for me, it's more about opening your thoughts, opening your mind, being open to the good and accepting what it is. And I have taken a little bit of every culture from every country and adopted it as mine, because I thought that was very cool. That was a very unique experience. And for me, really, the most important thing is about having good ethics, you know, letting ego aside, like don't let that and materialistic run in your life, but mainly just you experiencing the good, you know, attracting the good out there. So for me, it is interesting, because when people ask me like, where are you from? For me, I'm like, oh, that's a great question. I'm currently right now in Austin, Texas, but I'm not from here. And it so happens that my background is so diverse, but I guess I'm a border baby, and I say I'm a confused child, but I like to adopt the good. And I always, instead of saying no to something, I'm very open. I've gone to many different kinds of things that they do traditional in different cultures, and I want to be part of it, and I want to experience it as is with the actual people. So that to me is how it is. Like, yeah, I'm a certain race. Sometimes the dad pops up. It's never popped up more until the last 3 years. And I think it's just because of where I ended up working, because I think they needed to fill this void in corporate. Like, oh, we need a woman, we need a certain race, and we need a certain gender, and like certain blah, 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 right? So I think that's what just it got me, and I'm there, and I'm like, do you even really know what my skill set is? You know, and they don't. And sometimes they do, but sometimes when I question things, because I love questioning, I love learning, they don't like that, right? So to me, this has been the most impactful times as well. And just because I look at a certain kind doesn't mean I'm a certain race. It just so happens to be that my parents were Mexicans and then their grandparents were from different countries, right? So it's very interesting. I don't know. I'm curious what Shayna has to say actually as well. So.
So I'm very envious of the fact that you've got to travel all the places that you have. And I think that maybe the fact that I haven't done that and that I have stayed close to where I was born for most of my life so far, my culture is Butte. And that, for me, I mean, I love to learn about other cultures, absolutely. And I'm one of those open-minded people that you were talking about that, you know, I want to learn and I would like to adopt it as my own. But with so many different backgrounds personally, I don't feel very connected to any of them. My family, I guess I don't feel that anything that we do in our own like traditions or together is because of a certain race, because my father is Mexican and Native American, and I'm actually not in touch with him. And my mother is Sicilian, German, and Irish, but her stepfather is Italian, and that's who raised her. So I feel like like I said earlier, my daily life doesn't involve a lot of that being ever an issue. I think that, I mean, I struggle more with gender. I struggle more with when, you know, when I meet people, I come off very strong, and women seem to just hate me, and men seem to not listen to me. So I don't know.
Thank you, Shayna and Carmen. That's great. I have a question here that Jasmine has agreed to answer live. Has the hurricane experience brought the community together in a way that didn't exist before for the better?
Oh, sorry, I'm muted. So I think disaster has a way of bringing people together, just anywhere. Natural disasters, if you look at, especially 2017, we had 3 really, really big bad storms all back to back. So we had Hurricane Harvey hit Texas, and then we had Irma that devastated the Virgin Islands. It affected all the Caribbean, but really devastated the Virgin Islands. And then Maria, which again affected all the Caribbean, but really devastated Puerto Rico. I think, so disasters have a way of bringing communities together. I think if this question is in the context of race, I think Puerto Rico is a really unique place that if you ask most Puerto Ricans, they would say we don't have a racism issue. We don't have a problem with race. And I think that's because race is perceived very differently here. One of my really, really good friends, she's Puerto Rican. She has, light, almost blondish hair and blue eyes, and she calls herself Black. Because she tells me all the time that her grandmother is darker than me. And so I think, you see, you certainly see this, I think, in a lot of Latin cultures, where there's a different relationship to race, but nonetheless, it continues to be problematic, where there are phrases, very common phrases that are used that are, really kind of borderline racist. And we have a lot of images. There's a big debate now about the Jaucona coffee lady. She's got, sort of the red bandana, these are images from the times of Black exploitation. And so I wouldn't say that the hurricane per se has necessarily affected race relations from my perception, but I will say that the more recent events with George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter and the protests that were happening in the States definitely brought this conversation to the forefront. I see a lot more conversations around race, and and with that, more denial, more denial that race is an issue in Puerto Rico, but it quite frankly is undeniable that citizens of a darker skin color are treated differently. There is a lot of subtle racism that happens, but also on the positive side, we saw a lot of solidarity here. We had a couple of protests and vigils that were organized here in Puerto Rico. And I think that effort was very much, it wasn't self-centered, in the sense that I felt like Puerto Ricans were coming together to say, we stand in solidarity with Black Americans. So I think that was very encouraging to see. And we had, no violence. We had really the police were very supportive, I think, for the most part. And it's ironic to say that, because it's like, they only brought the tear gas out after people were violating the curfew with the protests, so not before. So it's like, we take everything in stride. But yeah, I wouldn't say that, in my opinion, that the hurricane has really been the catalyst for these conversations, but Black Lives Matter it's happening here. The same shift that's happening across the states is happening here.
Awesome. Thank you, Jasmine. I'm gonna direct this to Trevor and Izell. Someone, JK said, interested to hear input on ways to raise white children to be more inclusive, understanding, etc. We have family dialogues and work to be in diverse environments, school, travel, etc. What do y'all have to what would you suggest or say to that? We'll start with Trevor.
Hi, JK. I know her son. Her friends.
Oh, okay.
I would say you're doing good things. I mainly just like it's hard to be pretty injustice or for justice if you have friends that are of a certain race or sex or religion. It's easy once you humanize it. I feel like it's really hard to have these like hateful thoughts because you have someone, you have an example of what they are and how amazing the people they can be. So I guess being able to get them to learn about and befriend people of different cultures and races is helpful because also they'll like it too because they have more friends, they get more experiences. I just feel like a lot of the people that I've met that have this ignorance around them about race have been people who just haven't met or haven't had many experiences with people that are different from them. They're only in their own little bubble. So the things that get fed to them from the media or from the news or from anyone about like the horror stories with these types of people, that's all they have, and that's what they base their entire thought process on. But if someone's able to penetrate that bubble, break down these types of I guess stereotypes, it's really easy to befriend them and open your mind.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
Yeah. And I would say to actively consume diverse media. Studies have shown that people feel somewhat connected to what they're watching on television. Like if they keep seeing the same characters, they feel like they know them. Like the characters become real. And if you don't live in a diverse community, then you can always just consume that media. You can watch The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. You can go watch George Lopez. You can just go out and consume what those cultures are producing to get an idea of what they're going through and what they feel, and as well as to humanize them, like Trevor was saying.
Oh, thank you. One of the things that I had an experience was that my nephew moved out here with me a few years ago, and from Charlotte, North Carolina to Seattle, and from a world that was predominantly Black in Charlotte. And then I remember like when he was about to go to school for the first day, and I was like, okay, let me tell you this. Seattle is different. You're going to walk into a classroom and you're going to see all kind of individuals. It's not just going to be Black. It's going to be different races, different everything. So just take it in. Just be aware. I didn't want him as a Black man to walk into a room and be surprised that he may be the only Black man in that room. But he would actually get to see a lot of different cultures as well. And when he came home from the first day of school, he was asking all kind of questions about the different people that he had saw. So he was describing them to me, and I was explaining it to him. But for me, it was like, I am so happy that you had an opportunity to come out here to Seattle to get that experience. And sometimes it's just shaking it up and allowing young people to be among different people, to allow them to get to know that there's more than just one way, because we can actually get stuck in our bubble, right? We can be in our community, be safe, and stay there. But it's kind of a choice, like JK is making with her children. It's a choice to get them more involved and get them more exposure to different cultures. So thank you very, very much. We're getting close on time here, and that's all. Yes, Jasmine.
Well, I just wanted to add one sort of tidbit. I don't have any children, but was very fortunate to be invited to a 4-year-old's birthday very recently, which was a lot of fun. And this is a little girl was showing off her presents to me after, and I absolutely loved that. This was a white family, but I absolutely loved that one of the guests brought her a Black Barbie and Ken doll as a present, and she was just showing me her toys, all of her toys, and I was the only Black guest there. So, and I was not the one who bought the dolls, just give that caveat. But I was so impressed by one, just the thought behind that. I was so impressed by the fact that no one seemed to think that that was strange. The little girl certainly didn't think that was strange. Her mother was beaming over all her gifts and how happy she was. And so, you know, it was such a stark contrast, I think, from my own childhood where, you know, majority dolls, regardless of what the race of the, you know, sort of kid receiving it, were white. And so I think little small things like that go a long way, because it just starts to normalize diversity. You know, for this, I'm super excited about the future for this little girl and her sister, that they are being raised in a way where they're not being raised, in my opinion, to ignore race or to act like it doesn't exist, but they are being raised in a way that embraces our differences and celebrates the beauty.
Mm-hmm. And the interesting part about that, right, is like that was purposely right now, but then on the Black community side of things, or another ethnic community side of things, that we grew up and where we didn't have all these different dolls, and so we would get the white dolls or the white GI Joe men or what have you to play with. And so just to see that, and it was purposeful by society to not allow us to see people like us in our toys. And so to hear the reverse of that is very, very great to hear. So we have two more questions on deck, and so we're going to answer those two questions, and then what we're going to do is have the panel wrap it up for us, and hear about the upcoming program. So one question that we have is from L, and it says, I want to envision a time when racism is no longer an issue in the US. What other countries do you feel have dealt better with racism? What can we learn from them? Oh, y'all gonna make me call on someone. Everybody's like, I don't want to touch it. I don't want to touch it. Hey, John, you've traveled a lot, and you studied a lot. Do you have any insight?
Yeah, you know, but the places I've been have been, well, if you're in Africa, in parts of East Africa, and actually I was in Northern Africa, and you know, you see people mixed. But if it's closer to home, I would say, you know, I've always looked to Canada as a place that seems to be more accepting of other cultures and other races and people. And I spent some time there, and I spent some time actually in Vancouver, and that's kind of what I really liked about it. We have I think racism is a problem everywhere, and somebody pointed out, and I think it was something, I just want to talk to this thing, I didn't phrase it quite right, but I always thought that this idea of classism, and that came up a little bit in some things, and classism is really important. And I had, and I just got to say this, there was a fellow I had a conversation with in Detroit, a young fellow, about 24, and he's the one that brought it to my attention. He said that he thought classism was a bigger problem than racism. And, you know, that could be discussed in many different ways. But I think that every place has a little bit of a racism problem, and within different cultures, because, and that's been brought up a little bit, people will separate out because in Mexico, we have the very light-skinned Mexicans of Mexico City, perhaps in other places, and then they really have a problem with the indigenous people. And okay, and then when you go to an African country, they're also going to have the same problem. So there's a little bit of racism and classism and things going on everywhere. Just in this country, we've never gotten past the 60s. If we had a problem before, we thought we solved it, and and we haven't. That's all I can say on it. We have so much work to do here.
Mm. And I think that's the important thing, to know that we have a lot of work to do. And by hearing this conversation and going through your daily lives, that we're hoping that if you hear it and you know more about it, then you can act on it in a positive way.
I want to say one more thing, just a quick thing. This was important, and I have a granddaughter who's and she's a senior in high school, and she went to a high school where she was in the minority, a white, and she's learned so much, and that's changed her forever. And she doesn't see color because of that experience, and that's the key to everything. It's education, and it's young people, and that's the future, and that's what's going to change. You're not going to change an old mind, but you're going to change a young mind, I think.
But one thing I want to challenge about that statement is seeing color. That's said a lot in society, and what I want to encourage people is to think of it like this: you see my color, so you truly do see me as a Black person in America, or a Latino person in America, or Asian person in America. So by not seeing it, you're saying that you don't see my culture. So so just a little word crunch on that. Like, be careful when you say you don't see color, because then you're saying that you don't see part of my heritage and who I am. Thank you. And so we have a question, and I know this is specific to Seattle, but I know it happens all over the world. There's white liberals everywhere. So, and this will be the final question that we take from the audience today. There's never enough time for great conversations. So we acknowledge that. Seattle is the city of white liberals. Can we hear about the racism that is inflicted covertly? In what ways do you think they hold on to the status quo and anti-Blackness while still wanting to stand with Black Lives Matter? Whew. Daryl.
Yes.
What are your thoughts around that question? Those questions?
Well, Seattle is, we would always joke, Seattle, they would save an owl, they would save a spotted tree before they save the homeless Black man. And that's how I see Seattle being. You know, Seattle will do everything they can for the environment. But if they see someone struggling who happens to be of color, especially a Black man, you see it a lot downtown Seattle. You know, like when I would work in these office buildings downtown Seattle, I'm walking around, I just see it. And one time I noticed it just on my own. I was in this therapy, no, not in this therapy group, but I was in this design group, and there was this designer I had met. And I thought we had really clicked. So I saw him one day on the street, and he was a liberal dude, very liberal, you know, very aware. I thought he was super aware. And I saw him on the street in Seattle, you know, like First and, you know, like downtown Seattle, like right in the middle. And I went up to him and I tapped him on the shoulder, like, hey, man. And he jumped back. Like, who the fuck are you? Get away from me, you know? And I was like, I hired you for a job. We met. It was so weird. He didn't even know who I was. So I just kept stepping. And he's still on my LinkedIn, you know, but to me, that's Seattle liberal. That's what it is. That's what it is. It's all talk. It's all talk. Because if you took a picture of Microsoft, Starbucks, Amazon, whoever, just took a picture of all their employees, you would see it. And my thing is, people see this now. People see this. They see the BS that you're spewing, you know? And this is how I feel about it. It's like, I used to think I was selfish. At least I got in, man. I got in. But I brought nobody else in behind me because I knew we got 2 fucking slots here. Gerald's filling one of them and she's going to fill the other. That's just how Seattle is. They're all about filling slots. Let's acknowledge. I mean, in my experience, just like, let's acknowledge that. They're about filling slots, you know, and then they kind of do whatever they can. And, you know, they give here, they give there. They, you know, they kind of spread it out. But like, it's all talk. It's all talk. So I really want people to understand how Seattle really is. People here are suppressed in their emotions when it comes to talking about racism, but it's all around us. And you see it openly in the police force. That's where you see it out here, you know? So, yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, and no, I want to apologize for getting like raising my voice, but this is how I feel because I've been out here for 30 years and I have experienced this. And it was one person who told me something. It was Howard Schultz. And yeah, I'm dropping names. He told me when I was working for Starbucks, he said, Daryl Collins, you need a champion. You need a champion. People like you, Black men like you, Black creatives like you, who speak their mind, need a champion, someone like me that can help them. And that's true. So we have to be aware of that too, right? So we need our white allies to step up. Hey, doggy, we need our white allies to step up and, you know, to kind of see it and identify it. How you doing? I'm not yelling at mommy. Everything's fine. She wants to protect you.
Yes.
Hi.
Say hi, Duchess, to everyone.
Hi.
I just want to say, I feel like this same conversation is happening in the Black communities in Austin. You know, I know I'm sort of here representing Puerto Rico right now, but I just left. So, but it's the same sort of like feeling of duplicity, if you will, that, you know, Austin is this liberal bubble in the midst of a Red Sea, and you know, talk the talk all day, but don't necessarily act on these disparities that we see throughout the state. And you see it in hiring practices. And I think for me, on a personal level, it was getting really exhausting to feel like I was the only one fighting to diversify all white spaces. You know, on a really sort of like microcosm, it happened within the yoga studio that I was going to, which, you know, Austin probably boasts like the most yoga studios in a concentrated area in the United States. And, you know, I complained one day to my teachers. I was like, we don't have any teachers that are people of color. We, you know, and we're practicing an ancient practice from India. Like this is not a white, you know, sort of cultural practice here. And I found it incredibly frustrating that, you know, as much as Austin will talk about, you know, being the liberal safe haven, that there simply is not enough being done to try to diversify white spaces. And that is a reality. And it's again, it's tiring to be feeling like you have the burden to try to create those spaces at all time. Like you said, Daryl, we need white allies. And, you know, and sometimes it feels like when you call for those white allies, instead what you're met with is defensiveness of like, oh, you know, but here's all the things that I do. You know, it's the equivalent to like, no, I can't be racist. I have a Black friend. Like No, you can still have blind spots even if you're a white liberal in the United States.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Jasmine. Yes, John?
Yeah, it's being a white liberal is not a solution to anything. Yeah, it's interesting. We have these things that we're brought up and we're raised, and we have we form an opinion, in a split second about anything, and that goes with color. And you come out if you're okay, because I was born and raised in this blue bubble of Seattle, right? And so you right away you see somebody who's a different color, and you've never seen that, or you have no experience, but right away we get an impression, we form an opinion. And that's because if everything I knew is from media and something that someone has told me over and over and over and over and over again, then that's my idea. That's what I have. And even if I'm a young person. And so right away, there's there's a barrier that instantly happens. And then that barrier, you have to get through that. And that's when you see the person and you see who they are. And then they say something, and then you have an exchange. And then all of a sudden you can have a relationship. But we have these things that are just these barriers. And we have even more so today, because I don't think the way we communicate with technology and the things, and we're rounded up and put in our tribes, we're put in our places, and we're fed stuff that's just on our feed. It's whatever our preference is to sell us something. So we're even worse off today than we were before. The only good news is because of COVID and we were locked down and we all became aware of George Floyd. Otherwise, it would not have happened, because we were all there. And now this movement, and this is an amazing thing. I mean, I just needed to say that as a white person, it's how I was raised, how I was brought up, which I go back to the young people again.
Awesome. Yeah, one thing I noticed was that it took for the world to be in a pandemic and be still to finally start to hear the cries of Black people. And that is the saddest situation. If George Floyd would have happened at a time when America was moving and bustling and hustling, they still wouldn't have heard us. They wouldn't have heard any of the cries that Black people have been making for over 400 years. And it took a pandemic. We had to actually be physically still to listen. So we're out of time.
I actually want to add something to that, though.
Go ahead. Yes,
I think a large part of the issue is that we're always so focused in liberal spaces on sentiment, but I really think we should be focusing on the allocation of resources. Like the way the resources are currently distributed in this country, it reinforces racism, and it also reinforces this dichotomy where we do need white saviors because they have the resources. And so what I think we should be doing is focusing on empowering these low-income communities, these communities that are minority-based, in order for them to actually be able to help themselves and participate without relying on the whims of white people.
Thank you, Isel. I want to acknowledge some of the comments that are in our box before we wrap up. David said to Daryl, "It is interesting that you say champion. As someone who wanted to get ahead in film and television, I, as a white guy, always wanted a champion. As a photographer, my champion per se is a dear friend who also happens to be Black. At the same time, his work is so relevant and he needs champions to recognize his work, and everyone knows him." And I think David, I think that's a beautiful sentiment. And I think you are your dear friend's champion, and then you can encourage other people to champion them as well. And I love taking that away today. Like, we have to be champions for other people. Then we have, and David again said, "No doubt, I think as white or any color you are, it is important to recognize one's own blind spots and face this honestly. I love that comment. And then Terrence just said, we as humans must seek experiences with different humans to be more human. Wow, that is powerful. And so just to, I want to thank all of our panelists for being here today and sharing your insight. And just to wrap up, I just have one question I would like all of you to answer in a rocket in all of you to answer, because I'm not getting my words right because I'm still waking up. Not gonna lie. And I haven't had a Coke or any caffeine today. But my question to all of you, what is it that you would like to say? You have a the world is ours right now. We're virtual. What is it that you would like to say about racism, if you have one last thing to say on this platform? And we will start with Renee.
I say to acknowledge it, to to face it, and to say that it's, yeah, I mean, I'd say acknowledgement, because I do think that I've talked to some people and even some family members who were kind of a little bit almost dumbfounded that this is happening again. It's like, well, what do you mean racism? And I'm like, what? So I think just acknowledgement, and to some other points about education and financial distributing of the wealth.
Thank you. Shayna? Are you still there? Yes, there she is. You're on mute, Shayna.
Just want to thank everybody for sharing, because I actually learned a lot from it. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Shayna. Daryl.
Yeah, Daryl getting off mute here. Yeah, I just want to thank everyone that's on the panel, everyone that kind of showed up in the chat box there. And I think what each and every one of us can do is just treat each other like you want to be treated.
Yes. Thank you. Carmen?
Okay, so I agree with what Renee said. Educate. Also, awareness is very important. And just see where it's coming from, right? And before acknowledging or anything, just have some empathy in a way that, because education is super important. I think that's what really creates the whole foundation of all of this, right? It all starts from the core, and that's education. So it's acknowledging education for sure. And, there's stereotypes that people still believe in, and that's where education really kicks in, so really that's like the fundamental part of it. Education, love for all. If you want to be loved, you need to love, and they need to love you back. So it's just really being kind and love. That's, I think, what it is.
Thank you, Carmen. Isel.
Right now I'm reading this book called Why Nations Fail by Acemoglu and Robinson. And a core point they make is that often with disadvantaged groups, the reason in part that they're disadvantaged is because those in power within their societies aren't looking after them. They're neglecting them. And they're exploiting them and engaging in philanthropy, when what they really need to be doing is allocating resources to those groups. And so I just want to restate that I think that is probably the most important thing we could be doing right now, is just getting the resources into these communities so that we can uplift ourselves.
Thank you. Trevor?
Yeah, I guess what I'd like to say is I feel like a lot of white people feel guilt around racism, and it's perhaps not the best thing. There's a quote from, I think, Lil Watson, who's an activist for an indigenous Australian woman who's also an activist, and I think what she said was very powerful. She said, If you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound with mine, then let us work together. And I think that quote's very, very, very good.
Thank you. Jasmine.
I wish we had ended on that because it's such a beautiful.
I know. Dang, Trevor.
Well, I have a quote, but it's not so interesting. So the human body sends 11 million bits per second to the brain for processing. And yet the conscious mind can only process 50 bits per second. And I think that's an important statistic because we need to be conscious of the fact that we are actually working on autopilot most of the time. There's so much information being sent to our brains, we can't possibly, react in a conscious way at all times. And so that being said, racism, implicit bias, we all have these things. And it's a defense mechanism because, we can't consciously think about breathing and eating and walking. If we were trying to be deliberate, all those things, we'd all be falling all over ourselves all the time. I mean, I'm pretty clumsy and I kind of do anyways. But so I think the biggest takeaway from all that for me is for people to challenge themselves that when something is bubbling up for you, you're feeling some sort of visceral reaction to someone or something, is to ask yourself, why do you feel that way? To pause, because everything is happening on autopilot. We have to force ourselves to pause and evaluate our beliefs and think about where did those things come from, and is that still a valid belief? Is there still a valid reason for me feeling this way about another human being or about our entire race of people? So that's my tidbit for today.
Well, thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, everyone. And really do appreciate everyone from the panelists to the audience, to the organizers, to say thank you for allowing this space and opportunity for all of us to get together and have a respectful conversation about something that people say is hard to talk about. And it's only hard to talk about is because we're not willing to create the spaces for people to talk about it. And we just witnessed here today how if you bring a group together from various backgrounds and things of that nature and just provide a safe space to have conversation, that we can learn from one another. Whether you agree with what someone said or not isn't important, but that we learn and we heard each and every one of you, and we really do appreciate that. Coming up on John and his team have come up with some great programming that we're doing as well in the An American Mosaic dialogue roundtable discussions between everyday Americans. So coming up next is Saturday, August 1st on voting, why it counts. August 15th, the subject will be jobs. Where did they go? And if you are interested, whether you're on the panel now or in the audience of participating or being on one of those panels, please reach out to John via email. And John, what is your email address?
Yep, it's JVD mailbox, jvdmailbox@gmail.com. And we're really looking forward to the next two. This has been amazing. I just need to say one more time, this has been so amazing. I am so happy, so pleased that you people are here, and this has been a great, great conversation. And I'm sure we could talk for hours. There's no end to the subject. Thank you.
And we want to thank you for having a vision and purpose of starting to travel the world and just have conversations with anyone that you came across, and the approach to that, and setting an example of the importance of storytelling. And when you think of storytelling, don't necessarily think of it as a performance. Think of it as everyday conversations and sharing your story with someone else. I also would like to thank our behind the scenes folks, Ali and Gina and Alessandria, who I think had to leave us. But thank y'all for the support and helping to put this event together and really keeping us on track and things of that nature. I'm sorry we went a little bit over time. But that's the beauty of having conversations, virtual conversations, that there is no time limits. But the important part is I think we had an opportunity to hear from some really great people, and I really do appreciate having this opportunity. So thank you, John, and thank you, Gina, for introducing me to John, and to all you panelists, thank you, thank you, thank you. For just being human and sharing with us what it means to just be human in America when it comes to racism. So, John, do you have anything, last words?
One last thing, do not stop talking. We need to talk, talk, talk. We really need to keep talking. It's our voice. Let everyone hear it.
Conversation is the way to change.
It's the way
Appreciate everyone. Thank you very much. I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend. Bye.
Thank you.